Hi, I'm Peter Rulon, and I am going through a series of technical discussions on how to understand your digital camera. The general purpose of this is to get the camera out of the way so you can capture the pictures the way you want them, not the way the computer in the camera necessarily wants them. So this requires a basic understanding of how the camera works, where it's going to work for you, and where it's not going to work very well for you. How does your camera determine the exposure, or how to set the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, all subjects of future questions? But what are the fundamental assumptions that your camera makes when determining how to deliver the optimum amount of light to your sensor to capture the best shadows and the best highlights? How does it go about doing that? Well, inside modern DSL is a light meter, and prior to image capture, it measures the light through the lens and calculates the exposure. Now, some of the newer mirrorless systems actually take selective data off the sensor chip to do this. So it can either have a separate sensor exclusively for determining exposure, or on the new mirrorless cameras, it's going to collect that data from the chip. Not the whole chip, because that's just too much data for it to deal with. So when you push your shutter button halfway down in most cameras, it will measure how much light is coming through the lens of the camera, and it'll also adjust the focus. But if you push the button halfway down, that activates the exposure meter, and if you hold it halfway down in most cameras, it will lock that in. In some cameras like the Nikon, it will continually update even if you have the button down. But generally, you push the button halfway down, it's going to determine what are the right operating parameters to get a properly exposed image. Sometime in the late 1800s, there was a decision made, and that decision, probably made at Kodak at the time, was the assumption that on average the world reflects 18% of the light that strikes it, because what we are measuring in our meter is the light reflected off the subject that goes into the camera. Now, there are other ways to meter, such as measuring the light source, called incident, but generally our cameras are doing reflected light. So what is the quantity of light that reaches your sensor? And that measurement is then used to calculate all your exposure parameters. So remember clearly that your assumption is life is 18% gray. So here is just a quick 18% gray. It does seem a little strange that it's not 50% gray, but 18% gray is the average reflectance. So when light comes in at 18%, it's going to create a mid-tone gray. Now, you can buy cards that have a black band and a white band and a gray band, or one that is just gray, and it's called a gray card, and you can use that to perform an accurate measurement independent of what reflectance your subject has. When you push the button halfway down, if it can't find focus, it's going to not take the picture. So if you hold the button halfway down and it does achieve a proper, with quotes around it, exposure. On most cameras, if you continue to hold it, you can move the image around in your camera and it will not adjust any of those shutter speed, ISO, and aperture to suit the changing lighting environment as you move your camera. 18% gray assumption does work in the majority of situations. But your camera has no way of knowing, is your subject on average reflecting 18% of the light? And so what I'm going to ask you to do is to perform a demonstration activity for further understanding of why, when, or why this assumption doesn't always work. Now, first step, I want you to set your camera to manual focus. Usually this is a slide switch on the side of your lens. It says AF and M, you set it to M. It may be a button on some cameras, but generally that is it. Now, for the test content that I'm going to have you shoot, I want you to make sure that it completely fills the frame. Now, part of the reason for turning on the autofocus is that if it is a uniform field, it can't find autofocus and it won't take the picture. So by going to manual focus, it's going to take the picture. And then I want you to look at what pops up on the back of the camera. First photograph I want you to take is a black object. And I want you to take a photo of a completely black object and be sure to fill the frame with the black. Then I want you to take a second photo of a white object. For my example, I happen to use the ceiling, which is painted with a white. And so I took a picture of a white object. And then I'm going to ask you to evaluate the results. What do those two images look like? And do you understand why they are, to many people, unexpected outcomes? So I'd ask you to pause the video, grab your camera, manual focus, fill the frame with a black object, fill the frame with a white object, take your photographs, and let's see your outcome. So pause this video, please. I photographed a black object. Was it black? No, it was gray. If I photographed a white object, the outcome was gray. Why does this happen? Because your camera assumes everything is gray. So when it's black, it actually overexposes the image to bring it up to gray, which is where it's trying to get. If it is white, it will actually underexpose that image until it creates a gray image. So your camera had no way of knowing whether the subject was white, black, or gray. And so this is a flaw that you might face in certain situations where your frame is filled with a lot of dark or a lot of bright. The best example I can think of is if you photograph the moon at night. Well, most of the sky is black. Camera doesn't realize that, so it will crank up the exposure until the sky is gray, and your moon just absolutely, as long as it doesn't occupy the majority of the frame, the moon is absolutely just this giant glow ball. So if you photograph the night sky with or without moon, you're going to find that night sky is gray. If you photograph a close-up of a bride in a white gown, you're going to find it's grayish. If you photograph a snow scene, the outcome of the meter operating the way on the assumption that it made will make that snow gray with a blue tint because the snow reflects the sky. So how do you fix it at least at the level of this vlog? You can buy an 18% gray card and you use it to set your exposure. So it's called an external reference. So you place the gray card at the same distance and lighting as your key subject. You zoom the camera in so only the gray card shows in the viewfinder. You push your shutter button halfway down. Now, it has decided the exposure on an 18% gray card, so that exposure is absolutely correct, independent of whether it's all white, all black, all the whatever, it's going to get it right. And then you pull the card out of the scene and you take your picture holding down your shutter button so those exposure settings are locked in and you get it. Another way, this used to be in every single box of Kodak film on the inside of the box. It was called the Sunny F16 rule. And what it says that if you set your shutter speed to approximately what the ISO setting is. So if you have an ISO setting on your camera of 100, the closest shutter speed to that is 1/125 or 125th of a second. Now, if it is, you're out on the beach, then F22 is going to get you very close to the proper exposure. F16 is just, I'm shooting in bright sunlight, gets a little hazy, F11, and so on and so forth. So this used to be used by many photographers before they included a light meter in the camera. Okay, so now the next subject is, how do we override bad exposures? And I'm just presenting a tease here because the technique typically used to override exposure is called exposure compensation. And that is the subject of a future presentation. So that's why I ask you to get notified when I do my next discussion. And the other important concept of this sort of exposure discussion is, how do I tell when the exposure is correct without subjectively looking at the back of the camera and deciding that? So stick around. These are in the planning stage, and as soon as they're completed, we'll be rolling them out. Okay, so I ask you to please like, subscribe, and click the notification button for these videos. This way you will not miss the answers to the questions on the previous slides. The content was created through Peter W. Rulon LLC Studios. I am Dr. Peter Rulon, photography instructor, and I hope you have enjoyed this and learned something useful to aid in your creating great pictures. Now, as always, I do my little weasel words, which was some of these concepts have been sort of simplified for better understanding. So it just, you're going to understand the basic concepts from this class. However, there may be some individuals that seek further details, and that can easily be found on the internet. So thank you for joining us. See you next time.